Hi everyone, welcome back and thank you so much for tuning in. Today what we're going to do is we're going to continue our fabrication of the leg pieces, and the next step is to form the slot in the leg that's going to allow us to adjust the height of the top on this cabinet. Now, I have used my same sad test piece, this one with the big gap in it, and I've made some marks here, and let me explain what those are. First, I've drawn a line here 1.5 inches from the end, and I'm gonna say that this is the bottom of the leg down here. And the reason I've done that is because over here on the inside, we're gonna cut a dado to accommodate two thicknesses of 3/4 inch plywood. So it'll wind up being just a little bit less than 1.5 inches, but we'll deal with that in a minute. Those two pieces of plywood are going to form the base of the leg where the caster will be mounted. So it'll give us a good, firm, sturdy mounting place. From that, I've measured up 3 1/8 inches and I've made a mark. And from what will be the top of the leg, I've measured down 4 inches and I've made a mark there. And then in position, as you saw on the last video, I've made a mark all the way across, and that will wind up being our slot, and our slot will be nominally about 14 inches long. And that's going to be good because that's going to allow me to adjust the height of the top of this cabinet to match my table saw, and I can raise it up and be able to match the height of my bandsaw. And everything else in my shop sort of falls between those two heights, so I should be able to adjust this to fit any operation I do in the shop. Now, I don't know about you, but I really hate cutting slots. Slots are difficult, and even more difficult in plywood. It just is really hard to get a nice looking slot. But we're gonna try real hard, so let's get started. All right, now I have my test board here with the lines marked out, and I've set up an auxiliary fence. I've just clamped that to the existing fence. I've got that adjusted and tightened down. And the way I've adjusted that is to get the tip of this brad point bit right on my line on this end, and by scooting the board down here, I check and make sure the brad point bit point is right on that line there, and it is. So now what I want to do is I want to drill a starter hole just inside my end mark and come down here and put another hole just inside this mark, and then to the extent possible go along this line and drill out as much of the waste as I can. So we'll see how this works. Sorry, this drill press is quite noisy. Needs to be replaced. Okay, I'm gonna drill just inside this line here. All right, so I've got 2 holes now. What I want to do is come along and about every, I don't know, 1/4 inch or so, I'm going to put another hole and continue to work down this board. The bit that I'm using is a 15/64 inch bit, just a smidge under 1/4 inch. Whoops. because our slot is going to be 5/16 in total. And I just want to be slightly undersized because I think the slot making on the router table will be pretty accurate. So I'll finish doing this and then we'll take a look and see what this looks like. All right, I've got my holes drilled as best I can along the length of this line. A little bit of raggedness here. We'll see what happens, but now we're going to go over to the router table and clean up all of this between the holes. Okay, well, all the holes are drilled. It's a lot of holes. That was pretty boring and frankly a little dissatisfying. I don't mean to be complaining, but my drill press is really lousy. The chuck, no matter how hard you tighten it, and I mean really cranking down on it, you just can't get it to hold the drill bit very well. Secondly, it has some play. And as a result of that, I couldn't really drill overlapping holes because when I tried to do that, the drill bit would actually slant off to one side or the other. So I just had to space them as closely as I could. But I did finally get them all drilled. And you'll notice here, of course, because of the positioning of 2 in the back on the corners and 2 in the front on the corners, these boards are all oriented. I've got them labeled up here where this is the top, and you'll notice that 2 of them are running along the right-hand side of the board and 2 are along the left-hand side of the board. And I don't want to set the router table up separately for these. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to turn this board around, run it this way, and these boards I'll be running this way. Because of that, the stop and end points are in different locations. And I can't really set up stop blocks, so I've sort of got to do that manually. Now when I did my test, the very first thing that I had to do was to get the router bit centered directly on this line. And it took a little bit of micro adjusting. You can sort of see where I was going in and out to get it just right. Finally got it just right down here on this section. Now, when I was running these through, what I found was I was pushing them through this way, and I found that the bit it'd be a little hard to push, and then it would hit one of these holes and it would go real easy. And then it would hit the section between the holes and it'd be a little hard to push, and then it would go real easy. So I had to go really slow and methodical. And right down here in this last couple inches, I finally got it where I thought it looked pretty good. Now, because of all the trouble in drilling the holes, I thought I might try just cutting the slot without pre-drilling holes. Well, a couple of little problems cropped up. First of all, because of the end points and not being able to use stop blocks, I had to kind of guess where to do the first plunge through with the router bit. This router bit cuts great on the sides of the bit going back and forth, but it really doesn't have a point at the end that's made for essentially drilling a hole through. So it was a little tough to get it started, and no matter what I did, I was short of the end mark. So I had to pull it back to cut up to the end mark, and that was essentially a climb cut, and that just didn't go very well. So I went back to this method with the holes. I did another test, and I think it's going to work okay. Just got to take it slow and easy. So let's go over to the router table and let me show you how it's set up. Okay, this is a 5/16 straight cut bit, and I've got it adjusted height-wise to where it comes up just above, maybe 3/16 of an inch above the slot. And the reason I did that is because there are 2 tapered angles at the top of this bit, and I wanted to make sure that I was fully down on the straight part. as I was moving this along. And of course, the tough part is getting the distance of the fence from the bit, and it just takes a little fiddling to get it just right. Now, when I cut these pieces, I'm going to have to do, I'm going to have to come in and plunge through, and it'll hit one of those holes that I've pre-drilled, and we'll get it down flat. And then I'll have to pull it back, just a little bit of a climb cut. But again, there's a hole right at the very end marking my end of slot position. So it shouldn't be too bad. Once you get that done, then it can just go through. And you'll hear the bit, even though the dust collector will be running, you'll hear the bit when it hits a hole and when it hits solid wood. Hits a hole and hits solid wood, you'll definitely be able to hear the difference. So let's take one and let's see how we do. Okay, now I'm doing the climb cut. Back to my mark, and now I can do the regular cut. Never try to remove a piece of work while the router bit is moving. Okay, and there's our first slot. Actually, that's pretty good. I'll take it. So we've got 3 more to do. Okay, number 2. Okay, with the slots now cut in our leg pieces, the last step before the glue up is to cut essentially a double wide rabbet across the inside of each of the leg pieces. It's going to be nominally 1.5 inches wide and 1/4 inch deep. And the purpose of that is so that we can put 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood cut in a square and glued into the bottom of the leg to form a solid foundation for mounting our casters. Now to set that up, we're going to use the same exact dado stack setup, same depth of cut, just a little bit different on how we set up the fences. So let's take a look at that. All right, the dado stack is set just like it was before, essentially 1/4 inch above the table height. The stack width is exactly the same. I've taken my SawStop fence and attached this wooden fence, and there's a little cutout here. I've used it before so that you could actually bury part of the dado stack if you needed or wanted to. Now to set the distance from the fence, I've got a test piece here, and we basically want 2 thicknesses of the 3/4 inch plywood we're going to use. And rather than use a tape measure or a ruler, which could in fact introduce error into this, I'm going to do this real simple. I'm going to put a piece of scrap here just touching the dado stack, and I'm going to take 2 pieces of scrap plywood, the thickness we're going to use for the bottom plates in the legs, hold this down, and then just scoot the fence up to and tight to those 2 pieces of plywood. Now, what I should have is the inside cut of my rabbet, and then be able to just move this on the miter gauge out for the second cut, and I should get exactly the right width in that rabbet to accommodate 2 thicknesses of plywood. So let's make a test cut and let's see how this looks. Okay, now I want to caution one more time that on these pieces where you've got a bevel on both sides and you're cutting that with the bevel down, be sure that when you're holding the wood, you're holding it over the flat part and not over the bevel, so something like that doesn't happen. All right, let's try this cut. Looks like we left just a tiny little bit of an edge there. We'll get that. Okay. Now, what we want to do is see if our distance from the end is correct. And that's just perfect. So I think we're good to go. We're ready to cut now, and you will recall in the last video we used a numbering and lettering system to identify all of the leg pieces, and all of the marks were made on the top. So I want to make sure I cut the unmarked end. I would hate to cut the wrong end of these legs at this point. So we're ready to start cutting. Let's just get going here. All right, well, I've got 16 of these pieces to cut, so I'm gonna, well, 15 now. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut these, and then we'll get started on the last little detail before we glue up. Okay, I've mocked up one of the legs, and as soon as I remove this top piece and this side piece here, you'll see what needs to be done as our last step before the glue up. It's pretty obvious right here where we cut this rabbet. This channel that we formed, the L-shaped channel that we formed to hold the aluminum bar stock that's going to allow us to raise our table up and down, is extending past this rabbet, and we need it to end right at those solid blocks of 3/4 inch plywood we're putting in there for the casters. So I have this oriented where the end is correct, and the easiest way to do that is we'll just come in here right beside this rabbet, right on the edge, the shoulder of it, and we'll mark this L channel. Then what we'll do is we'll take this over to the miter saw, set up a stop block, cut this one, make sure it's exactly right, and then we can cut the other 3 exactly the same. So let's get that done, and we're finally ready to glue up these legs. All right, so I took the marked piece and I put it over here, and I lined up the cut, and I set a stop block here. I made my first cut, and it was just a smidge too long. I mean, less than a 64th of an inch. So I moved the stop block just a tiny bit back, and I'm ready to cut the second one. This is my cutoff piece from the first one. I'm ready to cut this one, and just double check, make sure I'm cutting the correct end, and we're good to go. So let's get this cut. I'm going to turn on the dust extractor. And that's all there is to it. So I'm going to get the others cut, the other 2 cut, and guess what? We're ready to glue up the legs. Everything is ready for the glue up, but this is going to be a difficult and meticulous glue up, and it's going to have to be done in stages. And I just think, considering everything, it might be better to wait and do the glue up in the next video where it can be covered better. I hate to rush through this and shortchange this process, particularly with all the work we've done on these legs so far. Now, I'm sure you'd rather I just go ahead and do the glue up now, but I think if you come back for the next video, you'll be glad we waited so we can cover this in better detail. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.